Well, good morning, all y'all. This is Pastor Joel Rice with PJ's Podcast, and want to do my sermon review this week on the fourth commandment, and it's a tough one. It's a commandment that most people don't like to deal with in the Christian church community. There's, I don't know if I would call them false teachings as much as more opinion-based teachings about what the Sabbath is and isn't. It's a long story, but we are going through the Ten Commandments, and I am trying to get us to understand that in those commandments, it's actually showing the great I Am's love. It's a series of commandments that if we don't understand the Ten Commandments, we don't actually understand what it means to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. They are actually reflections of what love looks like. And I want us to honestly and look at these laws and realize that God is a loving God. First and foremost, let's just start off with the beginning. Before he gives the commands in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, he specifically says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And to understand that is the motivation, that first of all, we are obligated because he is the Lord, creator. He made us. We're created in his image, yada, yada, yada. And we're obligated. Whether we like it or not, whether you like that thought or not, we are obligated to, obey our Creator. We were made a certain way. In his image, in fact. So actually in the Ten Commandments, you're going to see a reflection of who God is. Now, in that perspective, notice the next line, though, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. See, God didn't, yes, we're obligated, and yes, it's because he's our creator, but our motivation is because he moves, he cares. He did a whole bunch of things that brought them out of the land of Egypt, that showed his love and compassion for his people. Just like Jesus died on the cross for our sins, Romans chapter 5, verse 8, while we were still enemies, he loved us enough to do that. And that is the motivation. That's his motivation, and shows and should reflect in us why we should obey, is because of love. And we'll get to that in the sermon. So just to summarize the first three things is to have another God before the creator God is silly. It just doesn't make any sense. There is no other God. There is no one above him. In fact, to worship something else is not loving for us. I mean, seriously. It's not something that it would be loving for us to do, and hence why God commands us not to do it. Because we're taking not even second best. It's not even close. Nobody is even close to our loving creator God. They haven't died on a cross for you. They haven't created you in spite of your rebellion. They demand of you first before they act. I mean, our creator is so much more than anything else we could substitute for him, and we do all the time. And which goes into the second is we make idols all over the place. We worship money and people and stuff. American Idol is there for a reason. And we're designed to worship, but he has shown us and revealed himself to us. He has shown us his true image in Jesus. He's shown us who he really is. We have an image to follow. Jesus is the epitome of the one who reflects the image of the one true God, because he is God. And we are to reflect that image also. But we're not to be worshipped, but to point to the one who actually made us. And that's the point. Jesus is that image incarnate. And God has revealed himself to us. Thirdly, when we come to the third commandment of not using his name in vain, yeah, it's not just swear words. It's not just swearing by his name and then not following through, or making promises to God and not following through, which is part of it. But it's claiming to be a follower of God and then not living like it. We're using the name Christian or a follower, or, you know, whatever you want to name you want to call on, because you can. But the reality is if we're not living it, you're not actually, you're using his name in vain. It'd be like using the name pastor only because it's an easy paycheck. Yeah, you know, if you haven't been a pastor, you know that's not true. But anyway, but the reality is, people have used the Lord for inappropriate gain and other stuff, and that's the point behind even taking communion in an unworthy manner. So that's all those three, and that leads us up where we're up on the Sabbath, because he says to keep the Sabbath and keep it holy, and we shouldn't work, or our servants, or our kids, or our animals, and he gives a big list. And then he tells us why. Because he created in 6 days, confirming the 6-day creation, by the way, and he rested on the seventh. Well, okay. So the Sabbath day is holy, set apart for God's purposes. Now, we can get into a whole lot of stuff, and I'm gonna make a disclaimer right now. Against a particular denomination called the Seventh-day Adventists, who worship on Saturdays. And by the way, I have no problem with them worshiping on Saturdays. But a lot of people believe that because they're the Seventh-day Adventists, that's because they worship on Saturdays, the Sabbath day, and that's not why they have their name. It's because of a prediction that Jesus was going to come again in a certain year in 1800s, and didn't show up, obviously. And then that same leader decided 7 years later, 7 more days, according to the prophecy in Daniel, and he would show up, and he was wrong again. But that would be the seventh-day Advent, the seven more years, and he would show up, Advent, the coming in Latin, I believe. Anyway, but it has nothing to do with them worshiping on the Sabbath. It has to do with a prediction that was made by their original leader of that particular denomination. Now, so beyond that, they have some, I think, decent arguments on why to worship on Saturday. I have no real problems with that, because it does say in the law to do that. Now, here's the problem. When you start getting into the New Testament, the Pharisees, specifically as Jesus deals with these guys, had made laws upon the laws. See, there was also a Sabbath rest for the land every 7 years. And then every 7 sevens, the year after that, the 50th, there was an extra rest for the land, and everybody that was a slave, that was Jewish, and or had sold their property, were to get everything back. They were to be set free and to get their land back every 50 years. This was to happen. And the people of Israel went into exile, and it was determined how long they went into exile, which was 70 years, because they never did it. They missed 70 of these. So that's a lot, just to let you know. That's a lot of years and time that they didn't observe the Sabbath rest for the land. But there was also some things about not working on the Sabbath, which they weren't doing either, in the prophets and things like that. So when Jesus comes on the scene, they were doing everything to honor the Sabbath without actually honoring the Sabbath. They made rules like how far you could walk, a Sabbath day's walk, which is somewhere between 5/8 to 3/4 of a mile. But then they had rules to get around it. So, like if you own property within a Sabbath day's walk, you could walk to it, check on things, and walk back, which, by the way, checking on things would be considered work as far as I'm concerned. And so they had that loophole. So if you owned land that was the size big enough to fit both feet in, you could walk to that. And then if you own more land within a Sabbath day's walk, that was the size of your feet. So that's what they did. They could be 5-6 miles away, and every Sabbath day walk, they'd have a square foot of land. And they could walk all the way to Jerusalem, those 5 or 6 miles, and back without breaking the law. And it became silly. It was just silliness. And that wasn't God's original intent. And there was space in that law. And Jesus was showing them that in numerous places in discussions. And you can find that all throughout the New Testament. And basically he says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. And on top of it, the Sabbath was made for man, not for God. And the reality is when you study and you understand that when you give the land the rest every 7 years, and if you're planting wheat, for instance, it'll gain back some of its vitality. In obedience and trust to God, God was going to take care of it even further than what the land could do miraculously. And of course, they never knew because they never did it. So that's kind of some of those things that are in the background of why there was such a stress on, circumcision, and then also on the Sabbath. But when you get into the rest of the New Testament, it's the only law of the 10 that's never really mandated in the New Testament church. I mean, we're still supposed to put God first, amen? And we're still supposed to follow those other 6 laws that put our relationship with man, who are created in his image, in the right perspective. And the Sabbath is kind of just sitting there, and you wonder why. And when you start looking into Romans, chapter 14, he talks about let no one judge you on what you eat or drink or what days you observe. Some consider them the same, that every day's equal. Now, when I think that, I think, yeah, they're all God's. They all belong to him. I shouldn't worship any less on any day of the week. And things like that. I do believe that we should be setting up a time that we come together and that we rest and some other stuff, but I'm also not Jewish. So there's a little bit of a strife there in what that looks like. And especially if you're working outside of the Jewish community, they don't just stop and rest on Saturdays. Businesses stay open, and that was what was happening with these converts, is they were working, or maybe they were slaves of a Roman governor or somebody, or some Roman citizen, and they didn't do the Sabbath, so they had to work. They didn't have a choice. So what do? Well, and then you could take that on to Hebrews, in the book of Hebrews, and it talks about that Jesus is our Sabbath rest. That there is a rest yet to come, and yet is kind of there. And Paul, or whoever wrote Hebrews, talks about striving to enter into that rest. And finally, when you get to Colossians, and I think this is a really good one, is he says, let no one judge you whether you're observing the festivals, because now they've been fulfilled in Jesus, right? He is our Passover lamb. He is our, we are in the sojourning right now of the tabernacles, the tents. We're not in our permanent home yet. A whole bunch of things like that. And is it okay to observe them? Sure. Can you observe a new moon? Sure. Paul's like, I'm not against them. Can you remember the birth of Christ at Christmas time? Absolutely. Can you remember the resurrection from the dead on Easter? Sure. There's nothing against it. It's just that those things aren't saving us. It's not like those are going to condemn us if we don't do it. And even the Sabbath itself is not going to be the thing. Jesus is the substance, okay? The substance of all these. These are all a foreshadowing, and the substance is Christ. Now here's the kicker. But God is worth the time. We're so busy. We're constantly working. We never really rest. Even when we go to play, we go out to the lake and we, ski and do all the things that we haven't been really training for, and we hurt all weekend. We can't wait to get back to work so we can actually rest. We're working on our cabins and our, dream homes and this and that and the other, and we work, thinking that in that will give us security. Well, no, all that shows us is we don't really trust God. It's not any of these things are bad necessarily. It's just the whole idea that we never slowed down and took the time to really have relationship with God the rest of the week, and we refuse to do it on the times that we do have time off on. And that's a problem, people. We can't play that game of going constantly and saying that we trust God and that we're following God if we never rest in Him. And I personally don't have a particular day. In fact, the Jewish people, the Sabbath started at sunset on Friday and stopped at sunset on Saturday. And they would sell or cook their meals or whatever on Friday right up to the last second. They would start honoring the Sabbath at sunset. And the minute the sun set and it was still dusk and there was light, they would open their shops. They would start cooking their dinner that night on basically what we would call Saturday night in the evening when the sun set. Well, it was still dusk, and they never really fully honored it either, in a way, in my way of thinking. So I really want us to understand that, will you slow down and take the time? The I am is worth the time. And if we're to follow Him and to learn what it looks like to be like Him, to reflect His image, and we don't spend any time with Him, how will that work? We need to rest. We need to slow down. We need to really stop and think about what life is really about rather than what we're chasing after. And man, we are chasing after so many things, people. So many things that just aren't living up to their sparklies. But God is. Every time, all the time. He's worth the time. And if you want to understand the next 6, you have to slow down and understand who our Creator is. And you're not going to do that if you keep running at the pace of life. Will you trust Him with your time? Will you trust Him and slow down just to have a relationship with Him? I tell you, marriages don't work if you don't slow down. Raising kids doesn't work if you don't slow down. Working at a job, it doesn't work unless you slow down and actually evaluate and look at what's going on. People, He's worth the time. He's the great I am, and He loves you, and He wants to have a relationship with you. And you will spend more time with Him in eternity or away from Him in eternity. Man, I want to start knowing Him now, so that I know who my Father is. I recognize His voice when He calls me home. How about you? The I am is worth the time.